Hello, good afternoon. My name is Christopher Pontorado. I'm the communication specialist here at Docler Holding, and welcome to another Docler Tech Talks. This edition is going to be our JavaScript edition, and the title is Less Really More when it comes to JavaScript. Before we get into the topic, I'll let my speakers introduce themselves. We're here with Marine Virdol and Guillaume Monet.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Marin. I'm a lead front-end engineer at SustainCert. It's a startup here in Luxembourg in the climate and sustainability industry. My background is mostly in JavaScript. I started with jQuery, like when I started my career, but I rapidly transitioned to the modern frameworks like AngularJS I started, then Angular 2, and now lately I'm working with React. In my free time, I like cooking, sports, whatever makes me move, and traveling. So, and if you want to speak with me after this talk, you can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn.
Thank you, Marine. Guillaume?
Nice to meet you. Hello everyone, I'm Guillaume Monet. I'm a full stack developer, like Marine, mainly in JavaScript everywhere, so front-end, back-end, desktop, but with also a little bit of Java, and PHP is one of the language I started with years ago. And so I was a full stack developer here at RBC, so a small bank here in Luxembourg, and I quit my job in February to start working full-time on my side project Mokun. So maybe some of you are already using it. If not, you can go immediately and download it. I mean, no need to listen and just download it. And so it's an API mocking application, desktop one, available on the 3 major OSs. So that's it. You can try it, and like Marine, you can find me everywhere on Twitter, LinkedIn, and I will be happy to discuss with you about Mokun or something else or JavaScript, and that's it.
All right, awesome. Thank you, guys. Before we get into the talk, I want to give a little description of how it'll go for the viewers that have been watching us for the last few months. I think you already know what we're doing, but for our new viewers, basically what will happen is both of our speakers will go through a variety of different topics. Whenever you have a comment, a question, or even if you want to start a discussion within this talk, feel free to use the chat box on the right side of your screen, and then just write whatever you feel that you would like us to talk about, or what you would like other commenters and other viewers to read and comment on. When it comes to the questions and the comments, we'll try and get to them and have our speakers speak about them when possible, if possible. So feel free to ask as many questions as you like. If there are some topics in which we are not going over when it comes to JavaScript, we have 2 experts here who can definitely get into them and hopefully be able to answer the questions. So to start, I think one thing we can do too, and we were talking about it a little bit earlier, was how, at least from what I read, is that JavaScript is the most popular scripting language right now in the world, and it's grown a lot in the last few years, or however long that it's been super popular. So, you know, what do you guys first think about that with JavaScript? Why did you choose Java to be the main part of the work and the interest that you have in scripting?
You want to?
Yeah, I'll go first then. Sure. So yeah, it's funny because when I started working in the university, you do more like C#, Java, object-oriented stuff, and my first job was with JavaScript, and I found it difficult to start because it's very different, first of all, and you also have to learn about the DOM API and the browsers, and it's a lot to take in. So my enthusiasm was at the beginning very low, But once you start understanding the language and you start understanding the DOM and how everything fits together, I started to like it more than the others. So now I'm doing only JavaScript.
It's true that JavaScript is everywhere, and it's one of its strengths, and also a weakness probably. There is a steep learning curve. You have to understand how the browsers works, and also how the backend works, because you can use it with Node.js, and there are a lot of things going around JavaScript, because it can be run everywhere. And there is also, I think, an ecosystem problem compared to Java, which is quite stable, and I mean, it's not old, and it's evolving a lot, like PHP. And we say often that PHP is like dead and bad, but no, it's evolving a lot, and it's very good. And JavaScript, it's the same, but there is also some hype around every new fancy framework and library, and there is a lot of sometimes you can find articles like JavaScript fatigue, and there is a real fatigue also around the constantly evolving tooling, configuration, bundling, and state management, and everything is changing really, really fast, because it's a very dynamic ecosystem. But that's also very, very hard to work with it peacefully. You know, there is always this pressure to learn more, discover more, and maybe ditch the tool you just learned. So it's fantastic. It's very interesting, but it's also sometimes very hard. I don't know, to think about peacefully and just to, you know, with Java you just take Spring, you let Spring on the side the previous day, and you take it back and you continue working with it, and that's it. And with JavaScript it's not like that. So, but I love JavaScript, and I couldn't. I can work with another language, but I don't have that much pleasure. So.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's good, because I think you brought up earlier in what you were just saying about state management. So one of the topics that we plan on discussing is state management, and something about big libs versus homemade ones. So maybe you can start with that.
So I think it's part of this broad topic we have today of less is more, or is more really less, or I don't know how to turn that, but I mean, some times ago, everything was a single page application. You were developing your portfolio, and suddenly you were using Angular with 700 components for a portfolio, and nobody is visiting your portfolio. And also it's bad for SEO, because you don't have server-side rendering. So it was a huge monolith application for everything. And there is a trend to reduce everything everywhere, and we will see that with each topic. And for example, site management, for me, it's one example. Marin will talk about React more than me, because I'm not a React developer. I'm mainly using Angular. But we see the trend everywhere. For example, with Angular, everybody is or was recommending NGRX, which is one of the most popular library for state management. And you can find also other libraries like Akita. And now you can find a lot of articles trying to not to discourage you from using the libraries, because they can be useful for different use cases, but you can achieve more or less the same thing with EricJS, for example, which is an observable library, reactive programming library for JavaScript. And you can mimic somehow what Redux or NGRX is doing with some lines of Eric's JS code. It's not necessarily easier, but it's different, and you have less boilerplate. And I saw that in the past, that for example with Akita and NGRX, probably Akita has way less boilerplate, but there are a lot of things happening behind the scene, and you don't always know. And sometimes you have errors or bug or automatic 500 errors. You don't know where they are coming from, and they are coming from Akita, for example. So it's like you have to deconstruct the library for your use case, and finally you realize that you are just using that for some CRUD API endpoints. So you post, you put and you delete, And Akita does that for you, but then if you do that by yourself with the HTTP client, for example, in Angular, it's 20 lines of code. So do you really need the library that is obfuscating everything that is happening? So I don't know what you think, but
Yeah, so like my opinion on state management is that you know, the state of the application is how the application looks at any given time. But then the user interacts with the application, and it can look extremely different.
Sure,
And
yeah.
the problem is that you have all these different parts of the state that like a persistent state that lives on the server in the database. You have URL state, component state, and the biggest problem here is synchronizing your components while all these types of state change the global state concurrently. So this is the main pain point, and like you mentioned, many people, both in Angular and React, they went with the Redux pattern to handle everything globally, and that was good until some point. But I think now the JavaScript world evolved a little bit, and the main change happened when GraphQL entered the scene with the Apollo client, and they use this strategy of cache stale while revalidate cache strategy, which gives you the opportunity to handle server state in a much easier way. So only by this you reduce a lot of the complexity, because state server state is the majority of state in an application. I think it's like 90% of the state.
yeah, and most of the time it's the single source of truth. So
Yeah.
it's very important that
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So these libraries like Apollo Client, React Query, or now it's SVR or React, I don't know, Redux Toolkit Query, something like that. They all tackle this problem. So what, you know, with server state, I'm on my laptop, I update something, you're on your laptop, you update something, and how do you show the updates from the other user?
Right, yeah.
Normally you'll have to refresh, or maybe use WebSockets, but with this kind of library, just navigating to something else will update the data in the background, or not even navigating, but focusing, losing focus on the window. That also triggers a refetch in the background and updates the state for the user.
I see.
So
okay.
improves the experience of the user.
Sure. Now, are there any, because, you know, you were saying a lot of pros when it comes to like Angular and React, but what are some cons against, you know, these, because these are the big libs, right? Correct.
yeah.
So the cons against for these, as opposed, like, why would you want to use, let's say, the homemade rather than React, Angular, etc.?
Yeah, rather than Angular and React, rather than NGRX and Redux, for
Yes,
example.
yeah.
And I mean, for me, I mean, it's the boilerplate thing again. You have to learn new patterns, and they are not necessarily bad, but they are new. And also, you have to see how your team is interacting with these patterns, understanding them, and do they need training, for example. And sometimes for NGRX, for example, it's hard to I mean, it's one library among everything you have to do at work during the day, you know, reading the user stories and interacting with the product manager and everything that is also probably more important than understanding a library which is really complex. And the problem with these libraries is that they are really complex. It's new concepts, new everything. For example, Angular, I often replace NGRX and things like that by just simple observable with RxJS. That's a choice, but it's also a very complex library. still you are building everything. It's not like there is things happening behind the scene. So you are in complete control, but you have to learn everything new. You know, new way to interact with the data and to interact with the cache of the data. Is it cached? Is it not cached? Do you need to invalidate the cache? I mean, there are so many questions and things to. And the documentation of these libraries are huge. And for example, my approach usually, and it's one I took in Mokun, and if you look at Mokun code, I just warn people, there are some bad practices that I try to get rid of. Most of the time it's legacy code, but things happen. But I try to just use or leverage RxJS operators and to try to have one source of truth from a service and send the data everywhere in all the components with RxJS, and if I just put on the side some code that is doing side effects or things that are not core, I could say it's only 10 lines of code, and I can exactly know what will happen and when. With NGRX, I know the library, but sometimes I'm like, okay, what just happened? Why do I have this error? And I think it's harder, and if you have, like Marin said, if you want a complex strategy of caching and server-side caching or invalidating the data you have on the front because the backend is the truth, then maybe it's harder to use those libraries. I mean, at least for me. So and I saw that also in team where I was working in.
So on. Because now, since I'm not a developer, from what it seems like you're saying is that if you want to become a developer and like study computer science and software development, would it be best then to focus on learning how to deal with the big libs, or dealing with the homemade strategy? What would you guys recommend?
I think when you are a beginner, definitely you can start with the homemade, because it will give you a better perspective on how things are working. So you understand what's going on, how everything works, how is the communication with the server, how the data updates. So definitely, if you are a beginner, it's easier to get started with what the framework offers, and then maybe like libraries like NGRX or Akita works better in an enterprise solution where things get more complex and there are many developers working on the same application. So when you have a library forces all the developers to work in a certain way, while when you use something that is just from the framework that has more flexibility, can be different. So yeah, that's how I see it.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, when I started learning development, I couldn't even use a framework. It was in PHP because I couldn't understand what it was. So I did everything by myself with, I mean, more or less success. But
Sure.
so I learned to understand everything. And also in JavaScript, it's what is very special about this ecosystem. I think we shouldn't follow all the time what is hype. And when React came, suddenly Redux was everywhere, and you had to use Redux with React. I mean, you had to. You couldn't find an article talking about React without Redux. And I and other colleagues, and they were like, what is Redux? What is this new thing? And we have React, and we need that? Do we need that? That's the question. I mean, sometimes, you need to think about it twice, and it's like React versus Angular. That doesn't exist. It's different. It's like a chair versus a car. I mean, why would you ask? I mean,
Sure, yeah.
That's my point of view. It's a bit,
Interesting. So I guess now we can get more into front ends and micro front ends.
Yeah.
So maybe at first, if you guys can give an explanation of what micro front end is.
Marin, I think.
Yeah. So micro front ends. You can think of them like so you compose an application that has a different, like it's like a Lego piece, but it's not with components this time, it's with other applications.
Okay.
So the goal here is to have one application per business subdomain or per feature, and then have these applications developed by separate teams that can deliver independently from the other teams. So there is no, you don't have to wait for the others to do something. You can do, you just update your code, and that will reflect in the overall application. So, and there are some other things that enables you to do, like fault isolation. If one part is down, yours can still run, while with the monolith, when something is down, everything is down.
Sure.
And another important thing is encourages innovation, because, for example, you can have multiple frameworks working in the same application when using a micro front end. So you can try new things or get rid of old things easier than, and if you need to rewrite something, it's not like you have to rewrite everything, just that small piece that needs to be rewritten.
Sure, yeah. Is it like, do a lot of developers use micro front ends, or is it like a growing thing that's happening? What would you say?
Yeah, I think it's something that is still growing. It's not well established. There are no best practices yet, but the community is moving forward on this topic, and there are some solutions, not yet perfect, but it's getting there.
Sure.
That's all.
I think the challenges are the same than for back-end microservices. I mean, I love the idea of front-end microservices, shorter build time, smaller code base, and probably it's easier to understand what the application does. It's easier to update. It's easier to test also, probably, because you just touch this application, so you know that there are no side effects, because when with a monolith, you know how it happens. You have 700 components, you change something and you are sure that it's isolated enough, but no, it was not isolated enough, and you have 200 regressions on the other side. So I like the idea a lot, but I think you need a work environment very strict, very good best practices, code review, and everything, because it's like in microservices. When you have 15 of them, for example, what will happen when you update the business rules library or the configuration, database configuration library, and this library, and for the design system, for example, you will have to update the 15 library, 15 micro front end, for example. So it makes sense, and sometimes it will be very easy. You just bump a version, and it will build with the new library, and maybe you don't even have to write new code. But I saw a lot of times the same pattern, the same things happening is people taking shortcut because people are people. I mean, and the design system, it's another team. We need this new option in the drop-down. Okay, let's do it locally in this application, because then we will have to ask them, wait for them to create the user story, to develop and to push the library, the new version of the library, and then we will have to include that in all the microservices. Let's just do it locally. And I think, I mean, it's not even related to microservices. This is related if you have micro monolith, because where I was working, it was a little bit like that. Huge application, and they were huge. And all side by side, like microservices, but they were huge because it was huge application. That it was like that. But already code was shared between the application. It was very hard to enforce these good practices of always taking the right path when updating and but I think it's a pitfall that you can find nearly everywhere. But I think with micro frontend, it's even more real, you know.
Mm.
So
Yeah, especially when it comes to design systems like you mentioned, because overall you want a cohesive application that has the same look and feel, the same user experience,
yeah, exactly.
and it can get difficult,
Yeah.
to handle the design systems. But I think like with everything, communication is the key. So you need people to communicate between each other, teams to communicate between each other, and the same problem you can have it even if you have a monolith. If everyone
Oh yeah, definitely.
does whatever he wants, then here we are.
Yeah.
So is it pretty difficult to learn and adapt to these microservices as well, or if you already have some knowledge of it, it's doable?
I think it is the same than an application. You just have to think about it differently. And for example, if you have I never did a microservice. Maybe you have more insight, but my idea is that if you have a checkout, for example, a funnel on an e-commerce website, probably that could be a small services, separated services, service. And you have to think about it in like features or in different way, how to separate it. And probably most of the code that I've wrote in the past or with the teams I was working with wouldn't be ready for that, for example, because you would reuse things from a little bit of everywhere, anywhere, and so you have to be probably a little bit more strict about what is the border. I mean, of this service and this service, and then think about reusing, but with libraries, and probably the architecture is important here. But,
yeah. I think you want to, like the way I see it is you want to reuse as little as possible. So to share as little as possible between the micro frontends. So that probably means even duplicating some code. And this is like everything in software is a trade-off. You duplicate some code, but you go easier over it, so you don't do abstractions that make things more complicated. And there are also with the code duplication some performance issues, like if you duplicate React in each micro frontend, or if you have multiple frameworks. Actually, there are some strategies to share React in the between micro frontends, but if you have different frameworks, then there is no way of sharing. So you'll have more code to download from the server.
Yeah, definitely there are some challenges, and I think also with the number of assets that are loaded, and you told me before we start that there is a framework for, a library that is also managing the routing and like orchestrating the microservices, and that it's evolving, but it's not there quite yet.
Yeah,
no?
they are not quite there. They use ES modules with system.js, but I don't particularly like their strategy. Now I've seen this Webpack 5 came with the module federation, where you can think of you have containers of code, and then you have hosts. Each container can be either a host or a remote, and the host consume remotes, and so you can do unidirectional flows or bidirectional, sharing code, and each application will run independently from each other. So I think on top of this you can build cool stuff, but you'll need to be up to date with Webpack. And for example, that's that's an issue that we are facing at work right now. Most of the builders that we use, like they don't have Webpack 5 yet, so it's hard to use this pattern.
But I think it's like everything else. You have pros and cons, and it's evolving a lot, and you cannot jump on it immediately without thinking about it. It depends on the use case, and probably there are a lot of pros like lazy loading and things like that. But I mean, does it match exactly what you are doing or what your service is doing, your website? And you need to assess first if it's the right tool. But
it needs a little bit more planning beforehand than a monolith.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting because there's so much that goes into micro front ends and services. I didn't think it would be the micro part of it is even just a small title. It should be different, but yeah, one of the things that we can also go into is static site generation as well. Which one of you guys would like to take over?
I think that's
I think it's again this trend of reducing everything a little bit. So I mean, ages ago we had HTML pages. I don't know if people remember HTML pages. It's very hard today to remember that they exist, but it's like the natural behavior of a website. You turn on Nginx and you put an index.html and you have a website. You don't need a bundler, you don't need React, you don't need Angular, you need nothing. And what happened is that people were building websites, and of course at one point you put an index.html and then an about us and then buy something, and some things are repeating, the header, the footer. So we were needing website builders that could get rid of all the duplicated things, so you could create some sort of template. So we had first with PHP, for example, or Node, a templating system like Jade or Handlebar, Mustache, and whatever, that were serving static files and removing what was duplicated with small helpers and small partials. So that was ages ago, and that still exists, and it's working really well. And suddenly a single page app appeared, and as I said during the intro, everybody was using an Angular application for their portfolio, which was completely ridiculous. It was cool but ridiculous. And also the SEO wasn't working anymore because Google needs to parse the JavaScript, and it wasn't doing that for a long time. Now it's parsing the JavaScript. But for example, Facebook crawler, to get the small extract from the website when you share something, I think still they don't parse the JavaScript. So it means that if you have a dynamic page, they won't get anything instead of like capital letter title, capital letter description. So you still need to have server-side rendering, and then for a lot of websites you wonder why not just HTML pages. And then we had static website generators like Gatsby or tools like that are sometimes built with Ruby, I think, or Go. Hugo is written with Go and generates static websites. So you write something with their templating system or syntax, and then it generates folders and HTML pages. It's very fast. You don't have to render and parse any JavaScript. So okay, now I stopped there. That was the past and the evolution. And now we have frameworks like Next.js, which is a React popular framework that is doing exactly that. So now we have single page apps, very complex one with JavaScript. So React is very complex. I mean, it's simple compared to Angular, but still, I mean, we are in 2021. It's very complex in our ecosystem. We are ages from jQuery we were using 10 years ago, and which is still very used. And now you have a command, it's next export, and it generates a static website. And there is this trend now of reducing also what you put on the front end, what you put online. You don't want 5 megabytes of JavaScript to be loaded because for most of the people on Earth, it's impossible to use. I mean, not everybody has the latest iPhone or the latest Samsung, I don't know what. So there is a tendency of reducing everything. And if you try also to use Lighthouse, which is a scoring tool from Google to see if your page perform well, you can quickly have a very, very bad score, which is one of the small indicators to the SEO ranking. So there is this trend of reducing everything, and I think it's important. And it's also funny because now you have bundler or static page, but I don't remember the name now. I noted it in the
Vid?
file we had.
Vid?
Or there is Vid also, yeah. And the other one I don't remember the name. And their promise, for example, is to
Astro.
Astro, yeah, Astro.
Yeah.
It's very recent, and they promise to emit the file or to compile the HTML file without any JavaScript. That's it, no JavaScript by default. So we are back in 1999, and it's very cool. Yeah, and it's very cool because it's very fast, and it's what matters. What matters? HTML, semantic HTML, accessibility, and something fast and usable for everyone. And I think that's a good trend. I don't know what you think about this.
Yeah, I think back then we didn't have the necessary tools to get to this stage.
Yep.
So now, for example, Next.js, you can write React on the back end, you know,
Yeah,
like
also, yeah.
on the server, and that enables the front-end developers to do this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And also now we have this automation trend where we have the continuous integration, where you can run the build to generate the static HTML pages. So I think it's an old idea, like you mentioned, but with the tools that we have now, we can accomplish this. Yeah.
But because you kept mentioning that now it's pretty much a trend. Like what started making it this kind of thing popular? Were people just tired of this previous way, and someone was like, "Hey, we can do this," or?
I think they realized. I mean, people. We all realized that it was too much at one point. It's probably not being tired of using too many frameworks for a simple portfolio, because we like that. I mean, we are developers. We always reinvent the wheel. I mean, don't tell that to the product manager or product owner, but I mean, it's true. I mean, we like to create things, not just a simple HTML page. We like to use React and then generate the HTML page.
Right.
No, that's different. But I think people realize that. I mean, it blew out of proportion. In the past years, you had portfolios and simple website, like institutional website with megabytes of JavaScript, megabytes of images, and sometimes you can go on a website and the image is like 5 megabytes and the JavaScript is like 10 megabytes, and that's huge. That's huge. I mean, anything above, I don't know, 200 kilobytes or 500 kilobytes of JavaScript is huge.
It's a lot, yeah.
It's crazy, and we were at a point where every single website had 10 megabytes of JavaScript. Maybe I exaggerate a little bit. But what is also true is that here we have the fiber. In Paris you have the fiber. In New York you have the fiber. In Silicon Valley everybody is connected through the fiber. If you go out of those zones, you just cannot use the application. And I remember some years ago struggling running Google Map, and I was on an old phone with a slow connection. Not that old, the phone. I mean, I like new phones, but still, I really needed this navigation right now, and I couldn't have it because it was too slow to render, because it was too complex. Probably it's not JavaScript on Google Map, but still, it's an example of the point we were reaching. And also we saw a small application from Facebook, for example, Facebook Lite and things like that, because there are a lot of markets Probably that's a little bit cliche, but if you take all the India, Africa, and Middle East, and maybe South America, I don't know, but probably the infrastructure are not the same at all, and probably slower, and that's perfectly normal. And they have probably a very good internet compared to 10 years, but it's still not enough. So people realize that it was too much. And that also what matters, it's maybe not the fancy animation and the fancy single page app, because I mean your user wants maybe just to find your phone number, not to have some fancy I don't know what. And I think this trend is very good. And Next.js, for example, it's an example. Two times example, but it's an example of people caring a lot about the experience. Having fast website, rendered well everywhere, that are semantic. I mean, semantic HTML, so it's also accessible. I mean, that's important, and that is what is important. Finding the information. So
Yeah. I think in the end it also goes down to using the right tool for the job. For example, I still like the big fat single page applications for for something that sits behind the login, like an enterprise application where you don't need SEO, you don't need to I don't know, to have the smallest bundle in the world, and still the single page application provides you with a great user experience, also developer experience. I think.
But there is another example. WordPress is really popular. It's really slow. It's well known that it's really slow. It's improving a lot. I mean, it's a fantastic tool, and it's powering something like 60% of the internet, I think. It's huge.
Oh wow!
It's really huge. I mean, but for maybe not decades, but maybe for 1 decade, I don't know. But I mean, whatever article you could read about WordPress was how can I make my WordPress faster? Because it was built on PHP and it's always dynamic, it's always reloading everything, and everything is I don't know how to say that in English, but parsing everything again every time you open a page with all the plugins and everything. So then you have plugins to improve the rapidness of everything. I mean, it's a huge thing that you try to optimize afterward.
Right, yeah.
And I think this trend is for the better. But as Marine said, it's also for the better maybe that people start understanding that there is the right tool for the right use case. And for example, if you have a small institutional website with 5 pages, maybe you just duplicate the header in the 5 pages. It's a copy-paste and it's 5 minutes of work. And probably it's enough for the 200 visits you will have. The important is that people find the information that matters for them. So I think it's a good trend.
Do you guys see it lasting much longer? Or do you think people will eventually say this may be too, I don't know, simplistic or something like this, and maybe we should get to more dynamic stuff?
I think it will keep growing, this trend, because because developers I don't know, I'm tired a little bit of the complexity of the things, of the tools and frameworks. So I want to make it simple, and I want to use I want to start a blog in 5 minutes. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that.
And big companies like Google are also pushing for that. I mean, the SEO score has a variable linked to how your website is fast and accessible and everything else, of course, but also, is it fast? Is it lightweight? Is it readable on mobile, accessible and everything? And if you have a single page application, already you failed all the checks. That's it. I mean, you don't have to try to... of course, you can do server-side rendering, but what is server-side rendering? It's getting HTML page from your single page application. Your huge Angular translated in HTML. So we are there, back at step 1. So I think it's something that is here, and also it costs less. I mean, if you transfer less data, less of everything, and also the global warming and everything. So probably less is better.
Sure,
Why?
sure.
And you don't need a server to
Exactly. So it's
deploy these things. You can just use a CDN and that's it.
Yeah.
Ready to go.
It's super interesting. Wow. I think one last topic we want to go over is go more into detail with bundling. So, I mean, maybe one of you can start with saying, for people who aren't super aware of what it is, maybe just like a brief definition of what it is.
You go for it? You go for it? I can
go for it.
So yeah, the idea of bundling is, I mean, in the past, again, we had like one HTML page and we were just putting the JavaScript file in the page, and then we had a lot more, I mean, things to do and places where to use JavaScript and browser backend, and it's not the same not ecosystem. It's not the same platform, so it has different needs, and you cannot use whatever you want everywhere. And so I won't go into too much details, but the idea of bundling is to take all the libraries you are using for a project and to put everything in one big file. And for example, you can also strip down what you don't use. For example,
do some optimization
and also minification and reducing again everything, but also sometimes make it work for different platforms. So it's like some sort of tool that is building like one engine from all the tools you gave to it.
Yeah.
So it's a very important piece of software. But it's recent. I mean,
it sounds like something that would be normal when it first, for something like Java. Like at the beginning, you'd think, okay, this will make my situation easier. But do other scripting languages use bundling as well, or is it just, or do they have their own way of?
I think JavaScript is a particular case because it's somehow constrained by the browser. So until recently, you couldn't import modules in the browser. But now there is a development like ES modules that you can import in the browser directly. So there is no need for bundling. But not all the browsers support this because it's quite new, and there is also performance problem because there are many files, JavaScript files that need to be downloaded from the server, and there are some tools now. We discussed just before this meeting with Vite.js and Snow Pack, where in development you can use this new technology like ES modules. But still, for production, it's recommended to have a bundle for web performance, basically.
But it's evolving also a lot. And one of the first bundler, I think it's Webpack. Maybe it's the first. I'm not sure, but I mean, you had to provide configuration. The configuration is not straightforward at all. I mean,
and then it gets complicated very quickly.
It gets complicated. I had to use it for Mokun recently because the architecture changed a little bit, and I was like, okay, wow, that's complicated. And I knew that it was complicated. I used it before, and I had to configure a little bit before, but not that much. And there is also this configuration fatigue, because when you start a new project now, for example, you want to use TypeScript, so you need a TypeScript configuration. You need a bundler, so you need a Webpack configuration. You maybe use a linter for the code, let's say quality and
maybe CSS, like SAS modules.
A SAS compiler, so you need another config. A CSS post-processor, so you need another config, and I can go on like that for a long time. So there are already 5, 6, 7 config files. Everything has to play well together. For example, if you want the linting with ESLint and not TSLint, which is deprecated now, it has to play well with your TS config, and then the TS config has to play well with the Webpack bundling, which need to use correctly the Sass configuration and the post CSS configuration and this and that, and wow.
Yeah, so I personally try to stay away from that.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean,
use tools that comes with predefined configuration. Like in React, you can use the Create React app, but that's a little bit limited because you cannot extend the configuration, and sometimes in complex application you really need that.
Yeah.
So Next.js is I think a better option because it comes with all this predefined, and you can extend the Webpack config, and that's how we use it now at work. And well, yeah, one nice thing that I discovered is that you can use Next.js with and have a single page application. Not you don't use their routing. You have your single page application, but built by Next.js.
Yeah.
So you get the great CLI from Next with the developer experience, and you can extend the configuration. So it's nice.
Yeah, but this trend of having less configuration to do is very real. And there is also this project Deno, which is a competitor of Node.js. So Node.js is the JavaScript runtime that is used on the backend. It's, I mean, not the most popular because it's nearly the only one. I mean, that on the backend you use Node.js, and people weren't happy. Not sure exactly, but I think about governance and the evolution of Node.js, and so some people created Deno, which is just Node Deno, so it's just the opposite. And it's very opinionated. Out of the box, you get the formatting, the linting, the TypeScript, and without config. It means that you can immediately run a TypeScript file with Deno, and that's it. You don't have to configure anything.
Yeah, no bundles.
Yeah, that's quite opinionated because maybe you want. Again, you want maybe to update the config or customize something, and that's a choice. But I think it's a real trend because at one point, how much configuration is too much configuration? Sometimes, and with micro frontend, for example, it means that you have a smaller application, but you always have the same configuration size around that for each application. So at one point, all your application, the biggest code base is configuration.
Yeah.
So can you share it, the configuration? It's not always easy to share configuration among projects. And you can find bundlers, because we can go back to bundlers, but it's ROM, I think.
Yeah.
ROM. I mean, it does everything. It's not like Webpack that, I mean, Webpack focuses on transpiling, compiling the code, and ROM is doing everything like Deno, but it's not a JavaScript runner, but also the linting and TypeScript, everything. So you just put ROM in your folder, and then you create a new application, and everything is working out of the box.
We'll see.
Why not? Why not? We will see. Yeah.
Okay, great. Do you guys have any last words about JavaScript? What we've spoken about, like what would be the most important information, I guess, from today for a developer who's listening right now? There's a lot.
Actually, yeah, it's just to be informed and make informed decisions and use the right tools for the job that you're planning to do. That's
No, exactly. I mean, embrace the ecosystem evolution and novelty every day. But I mean, don't jump on the bandwagon every day on something new, because I mean, every day there is something new that is better, way better than what you were using the day before. And sometimes, I mean, it's tiring, and you just want to peacefully code what you know, and it's very important also in a company that you have something stable. And but I mean, it's a fantastic ecosystem. So
sure,
I mean, work with JavaScript. It's really cool.
Yeah, it seems like a lot's going on with it, and there's always something new happening.
Yeah.
So
yeah, definitely.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, Guillaume and Maureen, thank you very much for speaking here with us today.
Thank
To the
you.
viewers, thank you for tuning in with us. Also, a special thank you to Farvest for providing the studio and all of the audio-visual help for today's event. We'll have our next Tech Talk at the end of July, so yep, a month from now. If you want to find out more information about that, you can head to our website, doclertechtalks.com. We are also available on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and especially if you want to follow Guillaume and Marine, you can follow them on Twitter. And you both have GitHub pages,
Yeah.
correct, as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, so after the video is done, we'll post your information in the description of the link. Thank you very much, guys, and have a great rest of your evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.